The book of Revelation is a very sequential book, and sequentiality, it seems, poses a threat to PreWrath. More on this in a minute. The book of Revelation is very sequential. It has a certain structure. You've got the opening in chapter 1, the epistles to the churches in chapters 2 and 3, a prelude in heaven before the judgments in chapters 4 and 5. The apocalypse runs from chapters 6 to 19, especially from 6 to 16, with a series of plagues or apocalyptic events unfolding in 3 sets. Continuing to the destruction of Babylon in chapters 17, 18 and the beginning of 19, Christ's glorious return in the continuation of 19, then the millennium, the final rebellion and the great white throne in chapter 20 and eternity in chapter 21. It is very sequential. To give an example of phrases that show its sequentiality, you find in Revelation 4:1, "After these things, I will show you things which must take place after this." Chapter 7 verse 1, "After these things." Chapter 7 verse 9, "After these things." Chapter 15 verse 1, "The 7 last plagues, for in them the wrath of God is complete." Chapter 15 verse 5, "After these things." Chapter 18 verse 1, "After these things." Chapter 19 verse 1, "After these things." Chapter 20 verse 3 tells us that Satan is in the pit till the 1,000 years were finished, but after these things he must be released for a little while. Chapter 20 verse 7, "Now when the 1,000 years have expired." So we clearly see the sequential nature of Revelation with repeated phrases like "after these things." The sequential nature of the book of Revelation helps us place the judgments before or after the midpoint of the 70th week. As we said, there are 3 sets of judgments: the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls. The last 3 trumpets are called the woe judgments. The first woe is the 5th trumpet in chapter 9. The second woe is the 6th trumpet in chapter 9. Then comes the little scroll in chapter 10, the measuring of the city and the temple to be trampled for 42 months in chapter 11, the 2 witnesses in chapter 11, the third woe or 7th trumpet in chapter 11, followed by a series of mid-trib events in chapters 12 and 13, and onto the prologue to and the start of the 7 bowl judgments in chapters 15 and 16. Some might say, well, Revelation is not purely sequential. Sometimes John breaks the sequence to review different events. While this is true, we have to notice how carefully John weaves midpoint events between the woe judgments. Look at this. The first woe is the 5th trumpet in chapter 9. Then in verse 12 it's written, "One woe is past, behold, still 2 more woes are coming after these things." This is a very important verse showing sequentiality. I'll read it again. "One woe is past, behold, still 2 more woes are coming after these things." Then the second woe comes, which is the 6th trumpet in chapter 9. Then you have the little scroll in chapter 10, the measuring of the city and the temple to be trampled for 42 months. This is a midpoint event in chapter 11. Then you've got the 2 witnesses, which again is a midpoint event. Why is it a midpoint event? Because their ministry lasts for 3.5 years. That means it either starts or ends at the midpoint. So it is a midpoint event, and that occurs in chapter 11. Immediately after these midpoint events, it says, "The second woe is past, behold, the third woe is coming quickly." That's in verse 14. See how carefully John shows you this is sequential. Immediately the third woe comes, which is the 7th trumpet, with a declaration, thunder and lightnings, an earthquake, and great hail. That's all in chapter 11. Then again a series of midpoint events in chapters 12 and 13. The woman fleeing is a midpoint event. The 3.5-year persecution starts. That's a midpoint event. The beast speaks great things of himself. That is a midpoint event. He makes war with the saints for 42 months and controls the world. That is a midpoint event. His prophet comes and persuades everyone to take the mark, and there's persecution of all those who don't take the mark. Again, this is a midpoint event. and it's then and only then that there is the prologue to and the start of the 7 bowls in chapters 15 and 16. The only exception to this is chapter 14. The chapter is mostly declarative. It also has a picture of the Lamb on Mount Zion and the 144,000 that seems millennial, which is confusing to some. But despite this, the nature of its declarations suit their location in the book among other mid-trib events. This means all the events mentioned above, including the seals, the trumpets and the midpoint events we mentioned, happened before the 7 bowls. This means that the first 3.5 years of the 70th week are horrendous. They are catastrophic. And this is something that the PreWrathers prefer not to know. Most of the deaths of the 70th week occur in the first half of the 70th week. So to simplify what I'm saying, we see that John is weaving mid-trib events between the 2nd woe, 3rd woe, and the 7 bowls. All the mid-trib events that we described end before the 7 bowls. This shows very clearly, brothers and sisters, that the 7 seals and the 7 trumpets are all before the midpoint of the 70th week. If you're going to read the book of Revelation sequentially, as it should be read, and respect its sequentiality, this is the conclusion that you will get to. However, PreWrathers deliberately ignore this barrier and just place events where they like them to be, totally disregarding the sequence. They stretch the seals out so that the 6th seal fits somewhere about the 3/4 point of the 70th week, cramming all of the trumpets right to the end, and then they throw the bowls out of the 70th week altogether. Are people aware of this, that PreWrathers are placing the bowl judgments outside the 70th week? Why they do this, I haven't a clue. But I do know that they're stretching the seals so that the 6th seal fits somewhere around the 3/4 point of the 70th week, just so that it fits with their model. According to their model, the 6th seal is the same as the darkening of the sun and the moon in Joel 2 and the darkening of the sun in Matthew 24, and they'll do anything to achieve that. But as we said, if you're going to read Revelation sequentially and respect its sequentiality, then you're going to have to place the 6th seal somewhere in the first half of the 70th week. Now, I'll be frank and say that sometimes there is need to shift things around a little bit when you look at the bigger picture. But the kind of violent shifting around that the PreWrathers do with the text is unjustified. In any case, pretribulationists cannot be accused for reading the book of Revelation sequentially and respecting its sequentiality. If PreWrathers are going to shift things around, they are the ones who have to do all the explaining. And so far, all the explanations I've heard are insufficient. The main one being the comparison of the 6th seal to Joel 2 and to Matthew 24, which makes no sense whatsoever, but that is something that we will deal with in another video altogether. So just to cap it up, the book of Revelation is very sequential. When read sequentially, it lends itself naturally to a pre-tribulation rapture, placing all of the seals and trumpets before the midpoint of the 70th week and only the bowls in the second half of the 70th week. This sequentiality is a threat to PreWrath, and that is why they prefer to shift things around. Pre-tribulationists don't need to shift the sequence around in the book of Revelation, and that is why pre-tribulationism offers the best answer for the timing of the rapture from the scriptures. May God bless you.